Amen. Thank you. If you'll have your Bibles open to Hebrews 11 tonight, looks like we're going to get to finish Hebrews 11. We've been in Hebrews 11 for a while, and it's been great. I've really enjoyed looking into all these examples of faith. People would call this Faith's Hall of Fame, and so we've looked at a lot of individual examples. Tonight, we're just going to kind of go through several verses. We'll go from verse 33 through 40, and what we're doing is just kind of finishing up, putting a bow on this, and we're trying to, again, see what is true faith. What do we mean? When we say we believe in Jesus, what does it mean to have faith? What is the real deal? What is true faith? And so tonight we'll finish this chapter, and we'll see once again that true saving faith endures anything necessary and receives the eternal promises. It never stops. It never gives up. True faith never just kind of fades away and goes away. And as a matter of fact, what we see, and what is probably your experience as is mine, the more testing, the more trying that faith gets, the more it shows up. The more it comes to the top and really is seen. That's when Christians really are seen, is in the darkest moments. So sometimes what we're going to see tonight is faith. There's moments of testing, and when we pass those tests and faith is seen, it leads to some wins. It leads to some success. We'll see that, some examples, and we've seen that, I'm sure, in our own lives. But there's also times where we have these moments of faith, and we say, okay, I'm in. We passed that test, and instead of wins and success, it actually leads to loss. It leads to kind of the valley of the shadow of death experience. It leads to sometimes as far as torture for faith or death because of your faith. And we see that here in these verses tonight. And I just want to point out, that sounds odd to us, doesn't it? We're living in such a blessed time, in such a blessed place in history, that it sounds very strange to us to think of dying for our faith. We can't forget that we're in a bubble here in the United States. It's not that way everywhere. I mean, just a couple of months ago, we had a young missionary couple killed in Haiti for their faith. It's very real. It happens around the world right now. Go to Israel. Go to the Middle East. We'll find out very quickly. Go to India and China and so many places, probably 75% of the world. We would be persecuted for doing what we're doing right now. We wouldn't be able to do it in luxury and comfort. And so I want you to see that no matter what the case is, faith perseveres. Faith keeps going. So let's start here in verse 33. And what I want you to see is in these verses, these first few we're going to look at is these summarize instances where faith results in good, what we would consider good results in this life. In this moment, you can see that a person has faith and wow, that really worked out. You know, they're rewarded in this life, in this moment. They're vindicated right now. And it's all a good thing. So look at verse 33 here. We'll read that verse, the whole verse. It says, so he's talking about the prophets and the Old Testament saints. And he says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions. So when we think of just going one by one, what's it saying? When we think of people of faith who through faith subdued kingdoms, we don't have to think very long. Thinking back in the Old Testament, you think of Moses led the children of Israel, and they destroyed several kingdoms on the way into Israel that opposed them. You think of Joshua, obviously, he subdued a lot of kingdoms as he went into the Promised Land. David did that a lot. Lots of people in the Old Testament. And again, you can see, wow, by faith, they did it and they won. Here is obvious success. They did it by faith, not by military might. So then the next thing you see is they wrought righteousness. This word wrought means to bring about. They brought about righteousness, meaning that they were such a influence on their culture and their time that they were literally salt and light into their world. They preserved, they brought some goodness in. That's our job as Christians. But we see that happened throughout history. Everything they touched. You think that in this situation, this was something where justice was served because they were in leadership. The oppressed were no longer oppressed. There were good things that came to all people because of them. The faith did that. The next thing is promises fulfilled. It says that they obtained promises. And we can look back, if you remember in our studies, all of these Old Testament heroes we've studied, they all received some promises fulfilled in this life. You know, you think of Abraham, and he didn't inherit the land in the sense that we would think. He lived on it as a kind of a camper. You know, he was just passing through. He lived in tents. But he did have a son that was carrying on his line. He got that promise fulfilled in old age. All these things, he did see promises fulfilled by faith. All right, so, and that last thing there where it talks about stopping the mouths of lions, instantly we think of Daniel, right? Daniel did that. Daniel sort of slept one night curled up with the lions. He stopped their mouth by faith. But we can't forget that David and Samson stopped the mouth of lions too by killing them with their bare hands. And so in all these instances, you could step back and say, wow, Daniel, David, Samson, faith is really working out for you. What a great thing that you have faith. I think I'll have faith too. That sounds great. But then it keeps going that way, really. In verse 34, read this. People of faith, they quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the enemies of the aliens, of the foreigners. So in that verse, you know, quench the violence of fire, you immediately think of the three Hebrew children. We know them. For some reason, we've gotten in the habit of calling them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That is their pagan names. We need to get out of that. That's the name that Nebuchadnezzar gave them. It has connotations of their gods, the false gods. But I had to even look this up. I didn't know their Jewish name are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And here's what I want you to get out of these. That one quick little mention. We don't even have to turn there, but you probably have heard this preached about, and remember that when they're told you're going to submit and you're going to bow down to this statue, or I'm going to throw you in the burning furnace of fire, they said, we don't have to be careful to answer you. They said, our God is well able to deliver us from your fiery furnace, but if he don't. You remember that? Amen. But if he don't, we're still not going to worship you. What a wonderful testimony. See that, now listen, that's faith. Okay? And then you could say, well, it worked out, right? They went in the furnace and man, they came out the other side and nothing was gone but the cords that held them. Okay, but understand, they were prepared for either way. Didn't matter to them either way. Faith said, do what you got to do. However it works out, it works out. God's got it handled. All right, when you think of the next thing there, it says that people by faith escaped the edge of the sword. I mean, we'd be here all night thinking about people in the Old Testament, even in our times, who have escaped death in battle, escaped violence, and God made it happen. We see that throughout. I like this next one. It talks about out of weakness we're made strong. That's what God does. God delights in making weak people of faith strong so that he rightly gets the glory. He doesn't get any glory out of us walking around with our chest stuck out. He wants to see meek people and he wants to make them strong. Then the next thing is is these miraculous military victories when it says that they waxed valiant in fight and turned to flight the enemies of the aliens. You know, that was one of the things God said about the children of Israel. If they were following Him, that one would chase 1,000. You know, that two would chase 10,000. And so they did that at times. And so He gave these miraculous victories. You think instantly of men like Gideon, Joshua, several more. And then in verse 35, just look at this first line of verse 35. He says, women received their dead raised to life again. We know that the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha both raised women's sons back to life by faith. That shows the faith of the woman in, hey, I got to go find the man of God. And it shows the prophet's faith as well. So we see this by faith, but in all those instances, it's all good outcomes, right? And I love how this is arranged, because everything it says, you can say, man, that worked out. Okay? But we take a turn in verse 35. Right in the middle of verse 35, it goes from everything's going well to, oh, that didn't work out too well. I want you to read the rest of 35. It says, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. So let's look at this. Here is where faith is really seen. When it doesn't work out the way we think it should. I want you to notice that by way of tortured, again, think about this. From Abel in Genesis all the way until now, Christians have been tortured for their faith. We need to, again, understand what a strange place and time we live in. It's so weird throughout history. Even in so-called Christian nations before our time, go to England in the 1600s, just 400 years ago. If you didn't worship in the Church of England the way they thought you should, they're going to kick you out. That's why we have Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan got thrown in jail because he wouldn't take a license to preach. What that meant was, you're going to say what we tell you to say? Wouldn't do it. Throughout history, you'd have so-called Christians killing each other because they disagreed. And before that, there were pagans killing Christians. And it's just been a plague on Christians throughout. And it's what Jesus promised, isn't it? Blessed are the persecuted. I mean, that's what He said. That's what we're to expect. But we live in this world where that's just foreign to us. Thank God for that. It doesn't have to be that way. It may not be that way forever. We might see that in our lifetime, that it's not this way, that we won't be able to meet openly in a house of worship like this. We might have to go back to worshiping out in the woods someplace in hiding, as they've done throughout. I love that book Jim gave us, and a lot of us have read it, Richard Wormbrand. They would worship anywhere they could. They would have somewhere every Sunday, somehow everybody was having a birthday party. And they would celebrate somebody's birthday. If somebody come around, well, we're just having a birthday party. Have a lot of birthday parties. But my point is, it's strange for us to not to think this is strange. He says some were tortured because of their faith. And understand what that means when he says, right there in verse 35, not accepting deliverance. All they had to do was say, okay, I don't believe. All they had to do in the Roman Empire was say, okay, Caesar is Lord. Wouldn't do it. They knew how to get rid of Christians in the Roman Empire. All they had to do is come around and say, tell us Caesar is Lord or we're going to kill you. They wouldn't do it. The Christians, the one who had true faith, they'd die first. And they knew it. So, in most of these cases, all they had to do was renounce their faith in the one true God. It says they would be delivered, but they wouldn't accept that deliverance. And I want you to see that as well. That also shows they were never guilty of any true crime. If that's all you had to do was say, okay, I don't believe. Well, there's no true crime going on. People just hate God. People are just hostile to God. That's all there is to it. But it says they wouldn't accept that deliverance because their faith wouldn't allow it. Now, I want you to see this word torture is really interesting because it's a specific kind of torture is what it is talking about. The word for torture here means a drum. And what this was pretty typical throughout history. They would stretch a person as hard as they could, arms and legs, and stretch them as tight as they could, and a lot of times pull their sockets out and everything. But they would stretch them as hard as they could, and they would just literally beat them like a drum. They would beat them to death until they died. Now understand how slow that is. You don't die very quickly from just getting beaten with clubs. What that means is they had plenty of time to rethink their decision. While they're getting stretched out, they could say, whoa, hold on, it's too much. I don't believe in this Jesus. I don't believe in him anymore. They could say that. About the first or second lick, they could have said, no, I'm done. That's enough. And they said, okay, you're free to go. But they wouldn't do it. Can you imagine this? These hateful people filled with just rage, and they're stretching these Christians out, and they give them a few licks, and they say, they lean down and look them in the face. You ready to recant? All you got to do is, why would you do this to your family? Think of your wife and kids. Think of the people you love. You could go back to work. You could get healed up and be good to go. We'll take care of you. We'll give you some medical care. They wouldn't accept it. Why? Faith. Their faith. Understand, they were looking at these people who are stretched out like this. They're getting beaten. They understand they're looking at certain, slow death. And to renounce their faith at any time before that death was a sort of resurrection. They're as good as dead. But they could just say, okay, I give. I don't believe. But as the verse says, that they might obtain a better resurrection, they wanted a better resurrection than that. They didn't want to live in this life. They wanted to live in the next one. Now, I talked about this morning. We talked about the resurrection. I made mention very quickly that there are two resurrections. I want you to see this. Go with me to John 5, and this is what this is really referring to when it says they want a better resurrection. You need to read a couple of verses here. John 5, verse 28 and 29. This is Jesus talking about the resurrection. John 5:28. Jesus says, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice and shall come forth." Now, I love this. You remember this morning the professional funeral people? He says, give place. He's basically said, get out. He told death, get out. And that's what he's doing here. He says, death, where's your sting? I have the power over death. That's what he's saying. He says, they shall come forth. They that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. So get what he's saying here. All right. Everybody's going to be resurrected. Right now, I'm not real sure what heaven looks like. I don't think they're all spirits up there just floating around, without a body. It's a real place. But their body is here, in a grave somewhere, waiting for this resurrection. And eventually the soul and the body's going to be reunited, and this body that you have right now that has aches and pains and weaknesses, it's going to be resurrected, and it's going to be perfect. It's going to be exactly what you always wished it would have been. It's not going to be filled with these temptations that take us away from Christ that we hate and we don't want anymore. It's not going to want the wrong things. It's going to crave the righteousness of Christ, and it's going to have it because we're going to live in a perfect world with Christ as King. First here on this earth for 1,000 years, and then in heaven in the eternal state. The New Jerusalem. But I want you to see that resurrection happens before Jesus' millennial reign for believers. the one to damnation is going to, for unbelievers, that's going to happen 1,000 years later. They're going to be resurrected, put back with a body that is suited for eternal punishment, where they can stand flames and fire and agony forever and not die. That's the second resurrection. What these people are saying, who are being tortured, they're being beaten literally like a drum until they're dead. They're saying, I want that better resurrection. I want the first one. I want the one that raises me and I get to rule and reign with Jesus Christ. So you can take this life and beat me right out of it. That's what they're saying. Hey, that's faith. That's where it shows up. Now, according to this world, we'd look at that and say, boy, that didn't work out too well. You had a lot of faith and all it did was get you killed. Nope. Got a better resurrection. All right. So, keep reading here in verse 36 rather. Others had cruel trial of mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. In these verses, these are tortures that God has called some of His faithful people to endure. They might not lead to martyrdom, but He didn't call them to come out of these things. He didn't call them to a life of ease and comfort. He called them to this. Verse 36 could describe the whole life of Jeremiah, couldn't it? The prophet Jeremiah had all kinds of trials and cruel mockings and scourgings and imprisonment. There's lots of others, but he's the first one that comes to mind. Preached and preached and preached the truth and might have had one convert his whole life. Then they tried to kill him too. Look there in verse 37, and they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about. So in verse 37, we know that Stephen was stoned to death. We know that they tried to stone Paul to death and he wouldn't die. The sawn in two, we know that by Jewish tradition, the prophet Isaiah was literally sawed in half as an old man. Not while he was young and up screaming and yelling in the pulpit or something. As an old man, they got so sick of his just incessant preaching the truth, they said, we got to get rid of this guy in the most awful, agonizing way possible. And they did. But he wouldn't recant. Faith did that. Faith led him there. Think about this tempted. Again, tempted means that these saints had plenty of opportunity to turn their back on this faith that was surely leading to their death and torture. Now think about it. If you're Jeremiah wanted to, didn't he? You see Jeremiah's thoughts and he gets depressed, he gets down, he says, God, I would totally get out of here and leave these people to their own imagination. They do whatever they want to do, and I'll just go out in the country and live, and I won't have to deal with nobody else. I'll get up someplace away from everybody. But he said, your word burned in my bones like a fire. He said, I couldn't not. That's terrible English, isn't it? But that's true. He had to. He had to go and preach. Why? Faith. Faith drew him to that. That last part there of verse 37 into 38 says, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. What it shows us is that a lot of these heroes of the faith, they might not have became martyrs, but their faith led them to a life of poverty, loneliness. They had more enemies than friends. They were not living a life of luxury and comfort. Their big problems were not Is the church pews comfortable, or is the AC working at church? And, you know, we have first world problems, don't we? We do. These guys were poor, afflicted, beaten. They struggled through life, but they did it with joy. I think of the Apostle Paul and Silas having just taken a beating and bloody and in chains in a dungeon, singing hymns. That's faith. I hope none of us ever have to get tested that hard. But if we do, we'll praise God for it. It's hard to do, isn't it? It's hard to think about. Nobody wishes that on ourselves or anybody that we know, but that's how faith is seen a lot of times. I love that part there in verse 38 that's in parentheses. Of whom the world was not worthy. I love, John MacArthur has a quote on that verse, and I want to read you this quote. He says, "The world was not worthy of having such people in its midst, just as the people did not deserve the sufferings they received." Really, what it was is the world, or Satan's cosmos, this Satan's orderly arrangement of this world. They're not worthy to be around such faith and such convictions and such righteousness as these people had. They didn't appreciate them. They didn't see the righteousness and justice and goodness that they were bringing to their homes and to their communities. They didn't see it. It was like throwing pearls before swine. They just didn't understand. They did not appreciate how wonderful these people were, what an influence they were. All right, now let's look at these last couple of verses. It ends up this Faith's Hall of Fame study here. Verse 39 says, "And these all having obtained a good report through faith." Now stop there and think about that. What that means is that they were all saved by faith, just like we are. They're saved by faith. The just shall live by faith. Okay? So, what that means, it keeps going. It says, they obtained a good report through faith. They're justified by God, but they received not the promise. Now, here's what that means. They did receive a lot of promises. We just read that, right? In verse 33, they obtained promises. They obtained some promises. But they didn't obtain the promise of perfection. They don't have a glorified body yet. They're not living in Jesus' millennial reign, where this earth is redeemed and restored back to His rule and reign. They haven't received that. I love verse 40. Look at this. He said, God having provided some better thing for us. What is that? What's He provided? What's the better thing for us? Jesus. Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Jim's about to start preaching back there. They provided Jesus for us. They didn't even know the name Jesus. They knew a Messiah is coming, and they're waiting for Him. Here's to understand. They were looking forward to a Messiah. They were looking forward to His redemption by faith. But the better thing we get is we get to look backwards at a fact in history. We can study a man. We can study Jesus Christ and His life and His death and burial and resurrection. We can study His completed Word. They never had the chance to do that. It says that the prophets longed to look into these things, and they realized this information is not for us. It'll all come together one day, and here we are. We can see it all, and still so many people won't believe. Still so many people with all these facts of history. The people in Hebrews 11, it says here, God having provided some better thing for us, they without us should not be made perfect. You get it? They've been dead for thousands of years. Think about David. Peter, in his message in Acts 2, he could point to the tomb of David and say, our father David, he died, and he's still in the grave. His body was still there. Still is. But it ain't going to be forever. It's going to be resurrected. He's not, you get it, He's not going to beat us to the millennial reign. How cool is that? He's not going to get there before us. We're all going at the same time. It just blows me away when I think about that. We won't receive this promise of perfection. They won't receive it before us or without us because we're all still waiting on Jesus to bring it to pass. We're waiting on Him to come back. That's what we're waiting on. The perfect Son, God brings back His millennial reign, and He brings it to all of us. It almost doesn't seem fair, does it? Think about it. Remember Jesus' parable where he's talking about the landowner who goes into town, into the market, and he hires some people at the start of the day. And they go and they work through the heat of the day, and he does it 3 or 4 more times. And eventually he comes in at the 11th hour as the sun's about to go down. He hires some guys, and they barely get a chance to come in and grab up some tools, and it's time to quit. Well, he comes to pay them, and everybody gets the same. Everybody gets a really good day's wage. And he says, are you mad at me because I'm gracious? You know what he's saying? He's saying guys like Elijah that was sown into, guys like Jeremiah that lived his whole life taking beatings and imprisonments. He's going to live in the same millennial kingdom with the same glorified body that you and I are, and we're sitting here in air conditioning and nobody's trying to kill us. Almost don't seem fair, does it? He ends that parable by saying, the first shall be last and last shall be first. Everybody's going to end in a dead heat. What grace! I mean, we didn't have anything to do with that, did we? We didn't get to decide what time we were going to be born. But here we are, reaping the benefits. I want you to see this verse 39 and 40 brings us full circle. So we stopped in Hebrews 10, and he's telling the people, you need to have patience. You need to have faith, real faith. And he takes a whole chapter to say, here's what real faith is. Go back to chapter 10. I want you to see verse 36 through 39 there, the last part of chapter 10, and see what it is that we were supposed to be getting this whole time. Hebrews 10:36. For ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise. The promise. Do you get it? Understand, there's a lot of people that start down this road of faith. They say they have faith, they appear to have it, they do the will of God for a little while, but sooner or later something comes along and they just tail off. They just kind of, maybe it's not a big moment where somebody's beating them to death and they say, oh, I'm out, I don't believe anymore. Maybe it's not that. They just kind of veer away. They show they don't have real faith. He says you need patience. You need to do the will of God so that after you've done the will of God, you receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he that shall come and will not tarry. That's the promise. That is the promise. Jesus is coming back. He's bringing perfection with him. Verse 38. Now the just shall live by faith. But if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. That's what he's saying in verse 36. Lots of folks are drawing back. They do the will of God for a little while, but they draw back. It says in another place, their love will grow cold. Verse 39, but we are not of them who draw back unto perdition, but of them that believe to the saving of the soul. That's what he's saying. That's faith. Faith is never drawing back. Faith is to persevere, no matter what. Faith means that if you are Elijah or you're Jeremiah and you're being tortured, beaten, you're tested in that way, that you don't draw back. But you know what it means for you and I? Faith means that we're able to deal with the testing of affluence, comfort, wealth. Testing for you and I means that we will persevere and we won't turn our back on God when it comes time to go and have fun. When we get a choice between, are we going to follow Christ and do what He says to do, or are we going to go have a good time and take our comfort and our ease? We have that choice. They had the choice to say, I'd rather not be persecuted and beaten. We have the choice to say, you know what, I'd rather just go spend my time on the lake or the ball field or the race or you name it. Whatever. That's our moment of truth, isn't it? That's our test. And isn't it so much more subtle? Isn't it? Listen, we would say, our mind would be going, hey, I reckon here comes some persecution. Somebody might come along and say, you people at Damascus Road Baptist Church can never meet again. And we'd say, we're not going to have it. We're going to go meet out in the woods somewhere. We'll go meet at Spike's Chicken Farm. They'll never find us there. Wherever. But that's not likely to be our test. Your test is going to be when you just don't feel like coming to church. Your test is going to be something much simpler. Much simpler. It's going to be a choice between comfort and faith. Between convenience and faith. I want to leave you with one thing. One thought that sums up Hebrews 11. It's this. True faith endures anything and receives eternal, abundant life. That means it endures anything, no matter what the result is, good or bad. Doesn't matter how it turns out. Just the way it's going to be. We're going to believe, we're going to trust, we're going to follow. That's faith. But false professions on the other side of that, faith that is not God-given, true saving faith, does not endure. And it does receive perdition. As that verse says, there's people who draw back to perdition. I trust none of you are one of those. I trust you're not that. I hope this is enlightening. I hope that our study in faith has been a help and an encouragement. It has to me. If you'd like to talk about it, if there's something that confuses you, I'd love to talk about it more. We'll stop right there. George, would you lead us in prayer and dismiss us, sir?